Welcome to another Log Talk with Dave here at the British Columbia School of Log Building. Today we want to look at the top 5 chainsaw moves that a log builder uses when building. Cross-cutting, ripping, brushing, plunging, and notching. So let's get into it. Most of you will be familiar with cross-cutting because that's probably the most common thing that we do with the chainsaw. Simply cutting across the grain, cutting the log to length. Same type of move that we would do when we were cutting firewood. However, we do have techniques that we use to allow us to be more accurate when we're cross-cutting. So instead of just committing the whole bar, the full length all the way through the log and just chopping it off, generally we work through in smaller passes, and that allows us to be more accurate and keep the bar straighter as we go through. So this technique is used when we're either rough cutting or final trimming our logs to length. So let's take a look at that. Next we want to look at some ripping. So ripping cuts are the opposite to cross cuts. Instead of cutting across the grain, we're ripping with the grain. So we use this cut quite often, whether it's just to make a small flat section for a post to sit on, or whether it's flatting the whole length of the log, which we would do when we were cutting pitch flats on the ridge beam that the rafters were sit on, or the underside of the first log that has to meet against the subfloor. So generally when we're doing our ripping cuts, we usually have a line on either side to follow that comes off a horizontal line that's laid out on the end grain. And the trickiest thing about ripping cuts is that we have to maintain an eye on both sides of the line as we're working down. So it's a little bit of a practice technique to follow those lines, but constantly have your eyes bouncing from one line to the other. The main thing that you have to watch for when doing your ripping is that if you're focused on this line, say, and you're cutting and you're watching the bar follow along this line, you have to be aware that you're not absent-mindedly dropping on this side and falling below the line to maintain a nice even flat all the way down. Okay, we've got our ripping cut completed. What we can see is we have a general flat surface. We still have our reference lines in view everywhere, but we've got some high spots that we want to work down to our line. The surface as a whole is quite jagged, so we just from our back and forth of our ripping cut. So we want to work those high spots down. So we want to talk about our next move, how we do that, and that's brushing. When you're brushing, you're using the saw as more of a planing tool than a cutting tool. So you're just working your way down and just barely letting the teeth of the chain touch on the wood, working the high spots down. It takes a lot of practice to get efficient and smooth at this, and it's a fairly tiring move because you have to absorb 99% of the weight of the saw to just allow a slight contact with the teeth on the wood. But it's a very, very critical skill to have as a log builder. So let's take a look at what it looks like. The next chainsaw move we want to look at is called the plunge cut. Now the plunge cut is used when we have to create a notch that is fully contained in the middle of the log. So we have to have a way that we can essentially bury the tip of our bar right into the wood to begin the notch. So we would use this in a case where there was a mortise in the middle of the log, or on the back side of a blind notch, which is simply a notch that comes into one side of the log but does not pass through the other side. Plunge cutting is probably, it's an important skill, but it's probably comes with the most safety concerns of any of the cuts that we'll talk about today. And the main reason for that is the potential kickback when you're working on the tip of the bar. So it's very, very critical that you do what's called rolling into it. So we want to roll into our plunge cut. So we can't just take our chainsaw and go like that, because it would kick back on us. So instead we start as flat as we can and we roll into it, gently pushing down as we kind of pull back in a rolling motion. So best thing I can do is demo it for you so you can see it. The fifth and last chainsaw move that we want to look at is notching itself. We cut several different types of notches around here, and each notch has its own techniques that go with it, but each notch will always incorporate several of the moves that we've talked about so far today. So whether you're cutting dovetails like the cabin behind me, where you would do lots of ripping and brushing, or a saddle notch like we've got marked out here on this log, you'll use all these techniques that we've talked about. So I'm going to do a demo cut of this saddle notch here, and you can keep your eye out for several of the techniques that we've discussed.